They say the mind can play tricks on you when you're alone. I never believed that until last winter. I had rented a cabin in the woods, hoping to escape the stress of city life and get some peace and quiet. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor. Exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time hiking, reading by the fire, and enjoying the silence. But then the snowstorm hit. It wasn't the gentle, picturesque snowfall I had imagined. This was a blizzard, and it came out of nowhere. Within hours, the cabin was buried under a thick layer of snow, and I was effectively trapped. I didn't mind at first. I had enough food and firewood to last a week. But as the storm raged on, a sense of unease began to creep in. I chalked it up to cabin fever, a combination of isolation and the relentless howling of the wind. One night, as I was sitting by the fire, I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, a distinct, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the door. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind and hitting the cabin. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I approached the door slowly, the tapping growing louder with each step. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was a wall of white. I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The wind blasted me in the face, and I quickly shut the door, feeling foolish. There was nothing out there but the storm. The next night, the tapping returned. This time, it was more insistent, more deliberate. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door wider. The beam of light cut through the snow, revealing a set of footprints leading up to the cabin and then disappearing into the woods. Panic set in. Someone had been here right at my door. But who and why? I shouted into the night, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. No response. I shut the door and locked it, my mind racing. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, I ventured outside, following the footprints. They led into the woods, but the storm had covered any trace beyond a few yards. I returned to the cabin unnerved. I decided to call for help, but my phone had no signal. The landline was dead too, likely due to the storm. I was completely cut off. The days that followed were a blur of fear and sleepless nights. The tapping continued, always at the same time, always the same pattern. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I barricaded the door, kept the fire burning, and stayed awake as long as I could, clutching a kitchen knife for protection. On the sixth night, the power went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. The tapping started again, louder and more aggressive than before. I was on the verge of a breakdown. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. At first light, I packed a bag, dressed in my warmest clothes, and set out on foot. The storm had finally let up, and I was determined to make it to the main road. The journey was grueling. I trudged through waist-deep snow, every sound amplified in the eerie silence of the forest. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. After what felt like hours, I saw a figure in the distance. My heart leapt with hope. As I got closer, I realized it was a park ranger. I waved frantically, and he hurried over. I explained everything in a rush: the storm, the footprints, and the tapping. The ranger's expression turned grim. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "A couple of weeks ago, a man escaped from a nearby psychiatric hospital. Dangerous guy. We've been searching in the woods for him." My blood ran cold. The ranger radioed for backup, and soon I was surrounded by a team of officers. They escorted me back to safety, and I would never return to that cabin. I often wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night. The thought still haunts me. Sometimes the real horrors aren't the ones we imagine, but the ones that are all too human. One evening, I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived about an hour away. It was late, around midnight, and the roads were almost empty. I took a shortcut through a rural area to save some time. The road was narrow, surrounded by dense woods on both sides, and there were no streetlights. It was the kind of dark where you couldn't see anything beyond the reach of your headlights. As I drove deeper into the woods, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. Its headlights appeared suddenly, and it was approaching fast. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just another driver on a late-night journey. But as the car got closer, it began to tailgate me, almost bumping into my rear bumper. I started to feel uneasy and accelerated a bit to create some distance, but the car matched my speed, staying uncomfortably close. I tried to remain calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe an impatient driver who would soon pass me. But instead of overtaking, the car stayed right on my tail. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. I hadn't seen another car or house for miles. My anxiety grew as I imagined all sorts of worst-case scenarios. I decided to take the next turn, hoping to lose the car or find a more populated area. As I turned, so did the car. It was clear now that this wasn't a coincidence. My heart pounded and my palms were sweaty as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I kept driving, taking random turns, hoping to shake off my pursuer, but the car followed my every move. Finally, I saw a dim light in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station. I pulled in quickly, hoping that the presence of other people would deter the driver from whatever they had planned. The car followed me into the parking lot, but stopped at a distance. I parked near the entrance and hurried inside. The gas station attendant looked at me with concern as I explained the situation. He offered to call the police, but before he could, the mysterious car sped off into the night. I stayed at the gas station for a while, trying to calm my nerves. The attendant, a kind older man, kept me company and reassured me. Eventually, I felt it was safe enough to continue my journey home. The attendant gave me a free coffee and advised me to stay on the main roads. I thanked him and drove home, constantly checking my mirrors but seeing no signs of the car again. To this day, I have no idea who was in that car or what their intentions were, but the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine. It was a crisp autumn evening when I found myself walking home from a late shift at the diner. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the deserted streets. As I turned onto Oak Street, the familiar neighborhood felt oddly foreign, the shadows longer and the silence heavier than usual. I quickened my pace, the gravel crunching under my feet the only sound in the stillness. My mind wandered to the stories of recent disappearances in the area. It was said that people vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and grieving families. I shook my head, dismissing the thoughts as the product of an overactive imagination. Ahead, I spotted the outline of an old, dilapidated house. It had been abandoned for years, a relic from a time long past. Despite its state, there was something about it that always made me uneasy. Tonight, however, the feeling was more pronounced. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I passed by, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Suddenly, a faint rustling noise came from the bushes to my right. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears to catch any sound. The rustling stopped. My heart pounded in my chest, and I told myself it was probably just a stray cat or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the street, partially obscured by the shadows. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that concealed his face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he was staring directly at me. I forced myself to keep walking, my pace quickening with each step. The figure didn't move, but I felt his eyes follow me, burning holes into my back. I turned the corner onto Maple Avenue, hoping to lose him. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. Maybe it was just someone out for a late night walk, but as I glanced back one last time, my blood ran cold. He was following me. I began to panic. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the pavement. The sound of my own heartbeat echoed in my ears, drowning out everything else. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a distant mumble, barely audible over my ragged breathing. "Please help me," I gasped. "Someone is following me." "Stay on the line," the operator instructed. "We're sending a unit to your location." I kept running, darting through alleys and side streets in a desperate attempt to shake off my pursuer. But no matter where I went, I could hear his footsteps behind me, relentless and unyielding. I turned another corner and found myself in a dead-end alley. My heart sank as I realized there was no way out. A figure emerged from the shadows, slowly closing the distance between us. I backed up against the brick wall, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. The streetlight above flickered, casting an intermittent glow on the stranger's face. He pulled back his hood, revealing a cold, emotionless expression. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glinting object. My eyes widened as I recognized the blade of a knife. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my mind racing for a way out. Just as he raised the knife, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the end of the alley. The flashing lights of a police car came into view, and the figure turned and fled into the darkness. I collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down my face as the officers rushed to my side. The police never caught him. He disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the memory of his cold, calculating gaze. I moved away from that neighborhood shortly after, but the terror of that night stayed with me. To this day, I can't walk alone after dark without feeling his presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike.